You mentioned Ed, the Cowdens. The Cowdens and the Cowdens both moved to Chase Park 1 week apart from each other. So Ed is not the only person that's confused by us and our last names. In fact, I mentioned that last night when I was talking at a prayer meeting that we were having for Mindy and her family over there at Chase Park. I mentioned a second ago that we came down the Alcan 6 years ago. I'd been preaching in Anchorage, moved to Huntsville without a job, took a job at Wayne Farms over in Decatur, worked there for 14 months before the position opened up at Chase Park to be the evangelism minister and outreach director for Chase Park. It's a job that is, in fact, when I read the job description, I showed it to my wife, Maria. She said, that's written for you. And the reason why she was right in saying that is because as we were talking about outside, I didn't grow up in the church. I was in a non-practicing Catholic household, didn't come to Christ until I was almost 29 years old, April 21st in 1991. And when I made the decision to become a Christian, I took that vow and that decision very seriously. And so I have devoted myself over the last 31 years to being a student of the Bible. Now, the reason why I'm telling you that is this, and some of you have heard me speak. I don't know if anyone here's heard me speak before we moved to Alaska. I'd been in this part of the country some before we moved to Alaska, but 6 weeks after we moved to Alaska, I had a mini stroke. And before that, I could have stood up here and preached to you without notes, without opening my Bible and quoting the entire lesson from memory. I can't do that anymore. And so when I sent Wesley the PowerPoint, you're going to notice when you see it, it's a little bit different because it's almost word for word what I'm going to say. Because if I'm up here without it now, because my short-term memory is gone. I hate that. And that's one of the reasons why this job that I'm talking about was made for me, because if I had to, Josh, if I had to stand up before people every single Sunday, twice, and then in Bible class, it would be extremely difficult for me because that part of my memory is no longer there. And that's just one of the things that we have to deal with in life, right? So please bear with me as we go through this. And I chose, when Wesley asked me to come, I chose Daniel because Daniel, outside of Jesus Christ, Daniel's my favorite character in the Bible. You know why? Why would I say that? Pardon me? Because of his faith. Because of his faith, that's true. That's a good answer. There are a lot of very faithful people in the Bible. It's because Daniel is someone that we can look to like Jesus, that if you can search from cover to cover and you're not going to find anything negative about Daniel. Daniel is one of those people that we can look at and say, this is somebody that I want to emulate. When we listen to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, when he says, imitate me as I also imitate Christ, we could apply the same thing. I did last night at that prayer meeting I mentioned. At the very end of my prayer, I said, God, help us to imitate Mindy as Mindy imitated Christ. And isn't that true? When you find someone that's a very faithful person, doesn't it make sense that we will want to be like that person in those attributes that they have that are Christ-like? Same thing is true with Daniel. Daniel is a wonderful person, wonderful character study to look at, to see. And when we do the devotional, I'm going to talk about one particular point from one particular verse about why Daniel is such an important, in my mind anyways, an important character from the Old Testament, why he has left a lasting legacy down through the centuries and millennia down till today. So let's go ahead and get to it, because if not, we're going to be here forever. I think I have 58 slides, so we're going to try to go through them pretty quick, all right? When you turn to the book of Daniel, if you have your Bibles and you want to open to it, the verse that came to my mind first when I'm thinking about Daniel having a lasting legacy, something that down through the centuries that we can pull out of that and we can say, okay, I'm thinking about Daniel. What does God want me to know about Daniel? God wants me to know about Daniel that he purposed in his heart. We're going to talk a little bit about that in this lesson, about what exactly that means. Daniel 1:8 says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So Daniel purposed in his heart. But Daniel's legacy, we need to understand this, and here's why. I just got through saying it, I think I'm right. It's my opinion, so I think I'm right. That's what opinions are, right? We think we're right when we have opinions. I think Daniel's a really important character study, and I think it's really important for us to understand that he purposed in his heart. But I also think, so that we don't set Daniel up on too high of a pedestal, and we don't think that this journey started with the purposing in his heart, we need to talk about the backstory with Daniel a little bit. His story, his legacy didn't start in Daniel chapter 1. Before he purposed in his heart, there were some things that brought him to the point where he could purpose in his heart and he could become the person that God wanted him to be. And those are some of the things I want to talk about tonight. Number one, Daniel was prepared. Daniel was prepared. He was not living a life that we would consider to be a life of luxury. He wasn't living a life that we would consider to be a normal life. Don't forget, he's in captivity. He's not back home. He's not with his people back home. Now, he is with some of his people, but he's not with his family. And so Daniel was someone, and we're going to look at this and see what I mean by this, that was prepared to eventually purpose in his heart. According to Daniel chapter 1, prior to being taken away into captivity, Daniel was gifted in all wisdom. He was possessing knowledge, and he was quick to understand. These are very positive attributes that Daniel had before we even start talking about Daniel or reading about him in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel had the ability to serve in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. He was teachable. Daniel was able to learn the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. He was a highly functioning person before we ever come across him in the book of Daniel. Daniel was an impressive young man. The ISBE, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, estimates that he was somewhere between 12 and 15 years old when we come into contact with him. I don't know if that's accurate or not, because it's not in the Bible. And it doesn't say exactly. I don't think the original language points to a particular age for Daniel when we come across him. But somewhere in that range, somewhere in his early teens or mid-teens, more than likely. Do you know why Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were among those taken from Jerusalem, brought to Babylon, and chosen to serve the king? This is not circumstantial. It's not just it just happened. There was purpose behind this. Listen to this. About 100 years before the events of Daniel chapter 1 take place, Isaiah prophesied this to King Hezekiah. He writes this. I'm going to have to step a little bit closer because of that memory thing, so don't be offended, all right? I'm reading behind your back. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and what your fathers have accumulated to this day shall be carried away to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and they shall take away some of your sons who will descend from you, whom you will beget, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon 100 years. This was written before we read about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being taken away and being in Babylonian captivity. As children of nobility, Daniel and his three friends likely received the finest of Jewish training under the reign of good King Josiah. And this is evidenced by Daniel's refusal to defile himself. Do you suppose it would have been easy to have been in Daniel's position? You're away from your homeland. You're among people that maybe you don't necessarily associate with very much, and they're not your family. You're in a completely foreign land. Do you think it would have been easy in that situation to allow yourself to do something maybe that you wouldn't have done back home in front of your folks, right? You know how I know that's true? That it is easy to do that? Because I know a lot of folks, and I bet you do too, that when they're out of town, they don't go to worship. When they're on vacation, they don't make plans to go to worship. And so I'm not saying that's a good thing. I think that's a terrible thing. I think we need to make plans to do that. But see, that's kind of the situation, except these folks aren't even there under duress. They're just there on vacation, and they just make that decision. They make the choice not to assemble with the saints sometimes. Bad decision. Daniel, in a much worse situation, was doing everything he possibly could do to do exactly what God wanted him to do, exactly what he knew God wanted him to do, and he was not going to defile himself. Daniel was prepared because he knew what God would want him to do and what he would want him not to do. He learned this as a child, and it served him well as a teenager and adult. When I think, I'm going to divert a little bit, you can't believe that, can you? You can't believe that I'd chase a rabbit, could you? I've made a career of chasing rabbits, by the way, all over the world, literally. When I think of Daniel and his raising, the person in the New Testament I think about comes to mind first is Saul. You know why? Because Saul's family, where were they from? Saul of Tarsus of Cilicia. Okay? He was a Roman citizen by birth. Early on, his dad, who was a Pharisee, said, hey, we're moving to Jerusalem. You know why we're moving to Jerusalem? Because Saul, I'm going to put you in school. And you know where he went to school? You know whose feet he sat at from Acts chapter 5? Gamaliel, right? You know who Gamaliel was? You know what school Saul went to that Gamaliel was teaching at? He went to the school of Hillel. And Hillel was named for a gentleman, a Jewish rabbi named Hillel. That's why it was named that, right? Hillel was Gamaliel's grandfather. So Saul Sr. moves him to Jerusalem, to the most significant religious city in the world. He takes him to two schools, Shammai and Hillel. He takes him to one of the two best schools there are in all of Judaism, and he sits him at the feet of Gamaliel. You know how significant Gamaliel, besides being the grandson of Hillel, was? You heard the name Josephus? You know what he says about Gamaliel? When Gamaliel died, the glory of the law died with him. That's a pretty significant statement for a Jewish historian to say, isn't it? They held Gamaliel in high regard. So here you have, the reason I'm bringing that up is, Saul had it all. He had the pedigree, he had the connections, he had the schooling, he had everything that a Jewish person could possibly need in order to be what he ended up being before he was converted to Christ, which was rising in the ranks to the upper echelon of Judaism. Daniel, his upbringing would have been very similar to that, because he was, if we haven't already covered it, we'll talk about it. He was of the nobility of the Jews before they went into captivity. Before Daniel purposed in his heart, he prepared his heart through learning God's will. And you and I should prepare before we purpose as well. It doesn't make much sense for us to purpose to serve God if we don't know what that means. If we haven't counted the cost in order to know exactly what it is that God is going to expect of us if we are going to purpose to be His people. But before Daniel purposed in his heart, after having been prepared with the finest of Jewish upbringing, there was something else that Daniel had to do to be prepared to purpose in his heart. Daniel and his three friends were not the only children who were raised learning God's will, but they were obviously different, because they were chosen out of all those, right? There was something different about them. Well, what was the difference? Daniel was persuaded. See, we can be prepared. We can have all the knowledge that we could possibly cram into our minds about the Bible. We can be prepared by knowing what God's Word says, but that does not necessarily mean you are persuaded to believe what it says just because you know it. Wasn't it Khrushchev, some of you who maybe are my age or older, wasn't it Khrushchev that had the entire Bible from cover to cover memorized? Did it do him any good religiously? Didn't do him a bit of good religiously. He was prepared, he just wasn't persuaded. So this is the difference. Daniel was both. He was prepared, he was knowledgeable, and he was persuaded that this that I have been learning is truly God's will, and so I'm going to do my best to follow it. It's highly unlikely that Daniel and his 3 friends were the only religiously trained Jewish young men taken into captivity. Statistically speaking, I'm a math nerd, statistically speaking, it's almost impossible to imagine that they were the only 3 that had this Jewish religious training growing up. Of course they weren't, but they were some of the ones that were chosen specifically because they were persuaded about what they had learned. So why did they stand out? Could it be because they were fully persuaded that God's way was the right way no matter the circumstances? You know how we know that about his 3 friends? You remember that? About the fiery furnace? Were they persuaded? Of course they were persuaded that God's will was the right way no matter what their circumstances. After going on what you've heard the phrase about the diet, the Daniel diet, for 10 days, chapter 1, verses 11 through 16, proving that they were going to do things God's way even in difficult circumstances, God rewarded them for that. They're away from home, they're in captivity, you're a slave, you're in captivity. It could have been easy to default to a position of, well, we're just going to go along to be along with them and not cause any trouble, but they didn't do that. And they made the request of the different food and not eating from the king's delicacies. God rewarded them with knowledge, chapter 1, verse 17, skill in literature and wisdom. Daniel received understanding in dreams, in visions. All these things, it says, were given to them. Not that they already had them, but they were rewarded by God because of their faithfulness to God. When Ashpenaz brought the 4 young men to Nebuchadnezzar in verses 18 and 19, none were found like Daniel and his friends, and they were chosen to serve the king. God rewarded them because of their faith and trust in Him. And I would submit to you tonight, He's going to reward us for our faith and trust in Him, just like He did them. Why did they have such faith and trust? I believe it's because they were fully persuaded that God was with them and would bless them. Now, if that's true, if that's a logical conclusion from what happened because of them evidencing their trust and their faith, the logical conclusion is God's blessing them because they're fully persuaded. Doesn't it make sense that He would bless us if we're fully persuaded? But what if He isn't? Could it be? Could it possibly be that maybe in some regards we're not fully persuaded? Have you ever known somebody that wasn't really fully persuaded about what God's will was, and kind of, Jesus talks about some that are kind of not hot or cold, kind of in the middle, kind of lukewarm, not fully persuaded, right? Doesn't end well, does it? We want to be fully persuaded if we want God to bless us to the degree that He wants to bless us. After we have prepared ourselves to follow God through learning about Him, we too should be fully persuaded that God's way is the best way even in difficult circumstances, and that God is with us just like He was with them. Again, I'm going to divert a little bit just to tell you that I'm not likening myself, please don't take this the wrong way, to Daniel or to anybody else in the Scriptures. But in all my travels, in my mission work travels, I've only been in one situation that was even close to what Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Didn't involve a lion's den. It didn't involve a fiery furnace. I was on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, in the capital city of Honiara. And I was sitting at my table one morning reading my Bible out in the overlooking the bay. And I noticed these 3 men sitting at a table to my left. And the first 2 guys were just average-looking, average-sized guys. They both had business suits on. It was about 7 o'clock in the morning. That kind of surprised me a little bit, being on a southern Pacific island early in the morning. Here's 2 guys in business suits, and the third guy in the business suit. These guys were just normal-looking guys. The third guy was about 6 inches taller than me and probably 150 pounds heavier. He was massive. And the other thing I noticed about them, besides their attire and how big this guy was, they were drinking alcohol at that early in the morning. And I thought, this is really unusual. It really kind of struck me. And after about 15 minutes of talking over here, the man who appeared to be the one that was the leader of this group, this meeting that they were having, walked past me, and then the mountain walked past me and kind of shaded the sun a little bit, the rising sun. And when the first guy, he walked past me, and then he stopped and he turned around and he looked at me. And he walked up to me and he said, "Would you mind if I sat with you and spoke with you?" And I said, "No, I'd love for you to." So he sits down here, and the other guy, what I found out later, bodyguard, sat at the next table. He started talking to me, and he started asking me questions why I was there, because I look a lot different than people in Melanesia, because the Guadalcanal is part of Melanesia. All of their descendants are from the continent of Africa, okay? And so I looked a lot different than these guys, and they didn't see a whole lot of people like me in Honiara. And so he started asking me questions, and finally he got around to, "What are you doing here? Why are you here?" So I proceeded to tell him, "I'm here teaching a Pacific Island Bible College class at the Honiara Church of Christ." He goes, "Really?" He says, "Tell me about that." So I proceeded to tell him that I was there for 3 weeks. I was teaching these classes. We had worship service on Sunday. You're welcome to come. He goes, "I don't think I'll be doing that." And we proceed to talk a little bit more. And then he says, "You know what I think you should do?" I said, "No, what do you think I should do?" He said, "I think you should stop doing that." I said, "What do you mean I should stop doing that?" He said, "I think you should stop teaching that class." And I said, wait a minute. I just met you, and you're telling me that you think I should stop doing what I was brought to this island to do, to teach these classes at the church. And so what you're saying is you think that I should stop doing that. And he said, "Yes." Just like that, "Yes." And I sat there for a second and I said, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I knew this was a very serious situation. And I had to make a decision about how I was going to answer it. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that, because the God that I serve has told me that I need to obey Him rather than men. And I believe that God wants me here teaching this class, and I'm going to continue to teach the class. And he looked at me, he was quiet for a while, and he goes, "You know what your problem is?" And I thought, oh my goodness, where is this going? He says, "You don't really know the people of the Solomon Islands." And I have an answer for that. And I said, "Really, what's that answer?" He says, "Come with me. Come with me, and I'll show you the island of Guadalcanal, and I'll show you my people. And then you'll be able to relate to my people a little bit more." And I'm sitting here going, what am I going to do? And I finally said, "No, I'm not going to go with you. I'm going to go prepare my lesson. I'm going to go teach my class." I said, "Excuse me," and I got up and left. I told that story. You guys may know this guy. Some of you might know the guy that sent us over to the Pacific to Saipan. His name's Robert Martin. He's over in the Atlanta, Georgia area. And I told him that story. And he started asking me questions about where I was at and what the man looked like, specifically what he looked like. And so I described him, and I talked to him about what he said and about the big bodyguard there and everything. And Robert, who's been going to the Pacific since the early 70s, literally, I remember it like it's happening right now, he literally shuddered in fear. And what he told me was, the man you were talking to was the brother of the ex-president, prime minister, I can't remember which word he said, of the Solomon Islands, who is currently in prison for genocide, for killing 8,000 of his own people on the island, sister island of Malaita. He said, if you'd gone with the man, nobody would have ever known what happened to you. Now, I didn't know that. All I knew was, I didn't know that till after the fact. I was already back here stateside when I found that out. But I knew This is a very dangerous situation. And I knew that the only way that I felt like in that situation that I could, with a clear conscience, answer it and handle it is to say, no, I just can't do that. And then whatever happens, happens. And then, fortunately, I never saw the guy again. That's not the same. It's not the same as facing a fiery furnace or a lion's den, but it's similar because you're put in a spot where you've got to decide, am I going to be faithful to what God has told me to do, or am I going to listen to this guy? And if I'm going to be faithful to God, there might be some consequences for this. Daniel's example says, and his friend's example says, you be faithful to God and it's going to work out one way or the other. We got to be faithful. God's way is the best way, even if it's a difficult situation. Now, if you had talked to Maria after that, and if I'd never come back from the Solomon Islands and they never found out why, she my family would have obviously been devastated and all that. They never would have known if I had done what the man said, and that would have been hard for them to live with, I'm sure. But if you do the right things for the right reasons, for God's purposes, and something bad happens, then so be it, right? Is that what we learned from Daniel and from his 3 friends? Not going to bow down to your God. Our God's able to save us, but if He chooses not to save us, guess what? We're not going to bow down to you, right? Not going to bow down to this guy that's telling me not to do what God told me to do. Only after having been prepared and persuaded did Daniel purpose in his heart. You have to get it in the right order. You have to be prepared, you have to be persuaded before you can purpose in your heart. Now we get to the point, we're going to run over, aren't we? Will there be a bell? There will be a bell. Yeah, maybe? Okay. Daniel was purpose. I'm going to have to speed up. Daniel was purpose. The word purposed here means to determine or settle, to appoint, to decide, to devote oneself to. He was devoted to his service of God. In the Old King James Version, there's only one verse that I know of in the Bible. I can't remember where it is because of my memory thing. But in the Old King James Version, it says, talking about Christians being addicted to the ministry of the saints. It's the only time that I ever know of in the Scriptures where addiction is talked about in a positive way. Talking about Christians being addicted to ministering to each other. Daniel was addicted. He was devoted to serving God. And that's a great example for us. What was Daniel determined to do? He was determined that he would not defile himself. To defile means to desecrate, to soil, to stain, to pollute oneself. How would eating or drinking what the king prescribed pollute Daniel? All right? They could have been, whatever it was, could have been offered to idols, and Daniel would not have been able to participate in that, or else he would have defiled himself. It could have been included foods that were unclean for the Jews. That would have been defiling for him. It could have included alcoholic beverages, which would have defiled him, or any combination of those. Could have been any of those things, and there might be other things that I didn't think of when I was preparing this lesson. But those things that he knew of that he should not do, that God would not approve of, he just said, not going to do it, not going to defile myself. Whatever it was, Daniel knew that God would not approve, so he devoted himself to finding a way to avoid it. And that's an important lesson for us today, is when we know God doesn't want us to do something, we need to be intentional about going about finding ways to avoid whatever that thing is that God doesn't want us to do. When we've prepared ourselves through the study of God's Word, and when we are persuaded that God's way is the right way even in difficult circumstances, and when we have purpose in our hearts to follow God's will, then we too will devote ourselves to finding a way to do those things that God approves of and to avoid those things that God disapproves. Amen? That's exactly right. When we've done those things in that order, we don't put the cart before the horse. We don't start making commitments that we haven't prepared ourselves, and where we're not ready to purpose to do those things. Then if we do those in the right order, then we will have that right. So after Daniel was prepared and Daniel was persuaded and Daniel had purposed in his heart, then Daniel performed. Our pulpit minister, Rusty Hills, he's probably been here before. You guys probably have heard him speak before. He had a wonderful lesson the last 2 Sunday nights talking about a person securing their salvation. And when he gets to the last part where he talks about accepting what it is that a person has been taught, then there's only one step left after you've heard it and you've believed it and you've accepted it, and then you have to act on it. That's the point we're at with Daniel. Daniel had the rest of the backstory. He had everything in place, but then he had to do something about it. Daniel performed. Daniel and his friends didn't just, here's where the song came from, didn't just trust, they also obeyed. That's why I asked for that song, because Daniel trusted and obeyed, and so did his friends. Before the fiery furnace was superheated, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were prepared, persuaded, and purposed in heart. When their lives were on the line, they trusted God and did what they knew He would approve of, even if they did not understand how He was going to work it out. Didn't know. Very similar to Abraham, right? We don't find out until we read the book of Hebrews what Abraham was thinking, right? When he had Isaac and he was fixing to offer him as a sacrifice, and God looked at it as if He actually had offered him because He was ready to do it. We don't know from reading back in Genesis. We don't know the answer to that until we get to the book of Hebrews, when it says that he concluded that God was able to raise him from the dead, right? So now we know what Abraham was thinking. Okay, I'm gonna kill Isaac because that's what God's told me to do, and somehow or other God's going to raise him from the dead and return him back to me because he's a son of promise, right? Somehow or other, they had it figured out. God's going to work this out. Don't know how, but He's going to work it out. Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. You think that would have been hard to do to the most powerful man on the planet? And not a very nice guy either. It's not just that he was powerful, he's not a nice guy. It would not have been easy to do that at all. Before the lion's den was sealed with Darius's signet ring, Daniel 6 verse 17, Daniel was prepared, persuaded, and purposed in his heart. When facing seemingly certain death because of staying faithful in his prayer life, what did Daniel do? He prayed. Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 through 23. The very thing that got him in trouble. That's what we're going to talk about in the devotional. The very thing that got him in trouble is the thing he did when he was told not to do it. Verse 23 explicitly states this. That should say, so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury was found on him. Why? Because he believed in his God. He believed, he trusted, and he obeyed his God. When we are prepared, persuaded, and have purpose of heart, we too must obey, even in difficult situations. Before we close, I wanted to share this with you, because sometimes when we get to the end of the story of Daniel, especially with the lion's den, and you read about Darius or Darius, however you say it, and you know he's welcoming him out of the den, and he talks about your God. Your God has saved you, and we kind of come away with this warm fuzzy about Darius. That's not the right image. That's not who this guy was. This was very, very out of character for him. Here's some of the things he said. We shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Those are the guys that wanted to throw Daniel in the lion's den, right? They had to find something, and the only thing they could find was anything related to the law. What a great compliment. That's what we're going to talk about here in a second. That's what got Daniel in trouble. After being tricked, King Darius was greatly distressed because Daniel would likely die because of his decree, and tried to come up with a solution all night long, verse 14. Why? Because he knew Daniel was a good and a godly man. Darius said, your God whom you serve continually will deliver you. Darius recognized Daniel's faithfulness and his God's power, even though he was not a believer in God. He wasn't a believer in Daniel's God, but he knew Daniel was. And Daniel's God had just saved him from the lions. Darius says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions. Verse 20. And then, after Daniel's deliverance by God, Darius says this. I'm going to try to read it quickly. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, For he is a living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who had delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? Chapter 6, verse 26 and 27. So we have a guy that doesn't care anything about God, and this is what he's saying about Daniel's God. So that we don't come away with this wrong idea because of all these nice things he's saying after Jehovah saved Daniel from the lion's den. We don't want to come away from this thinking he was just basically a good guy wanting to do the right thing. He did here because he was forced into that position because of the mighty works that God had just shown him. Have you ever heard of this guy? Zopyrus the Persian? Does that picture disturb you? You know why there's an inscription on this coin of this guy? Because this guy served under Darius, and the Babylonians were revolting, and they were going to come take the city, and there was nothing they could do about it. And this guy came up with the idea. Here's what he did, and this isn't in the Bible, so we're going to take it with a grain of salt, but this is the way it's recorded in history. He takes a knife, and he cuts off his own nose and his own ears, and he goes into the king's chambers, asks to talk to the king. Darius says, what in the world happened to you? Who did it? I'll take care of it. He said, I did it myself. Why'd you do that? He said, because we're fixing to get overrun and there's nothing we're going to be able to do about it. And so what I figured I would do is I would go to our enemy and I would tell him, this is what Darius did to me. I want to get back at him. I want to defect. And that's what he did. And they listened to him. And he became a commander of their army, and he led them right into an ambush that was set up with Darius, and they wiped out the entire army because of what this guy did. This guy became the number 2, according to history, became the number 2 guy underneath Darius because he did this for his people. The point I'm making about Darius is he set up this plan to fool these people that were rebelling against him, and he slaughtered every last one of them. Killed them all, just like the guy in the Solomon Islands. No quarter whatsoever. Darius wasn't the nice guy that sometimes we come away from these stories about how he reacted at the end of the account of Daniel. Don't go away from it with that. But the point is this. Darius was a hard-hearted, vicious ruler who thought nothing about killing mass numbers of people, and yet it all comes back to evangelism when you listen to me talk. Daniel's faithful example impacted him. If Daniel could impact this guy, you and I can impact the people we come into contact with. Because more than likely, you don't come into contact with people that are killing off mass numbers of people. Now, you might, but it's more than likely you're not, right? More than likely, the people that we have influence over in our circle of influence are not like this guy, and we might have a chance to win them from Christ. I think we're going to just have to stop there. I think there's more slides, right, Wes? But we're going to go ahead and stop there, and we'll have some concluding thoughts about this during the devotional period. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.